So back once again and taking a look at trusts this morning, I guess it is, this morning here. Beautiful sunny day in southwest Missouri. Maybe thought it was later in the day than it is, but it's a beautiful sunny morning this morning. But continuing with our discussion of trusts. Trust. What can we know about trusts? Can we trust them? Well, here's this article again. There's a widespread conviction in the minds of the American people that the great corporations known as trusts are in certain of their features and tendencies hurtful to the general welfare. This would be Theodore Roosevelt. From Roosevelt to Wilson is the time period here. Roosevelt reported to Congress in 1901. That was a quote. Like most people, however, the president wavered on the trusts, and for good reason. We'll find out more about that in a moment. Large-scale production and industrial growth, he believed, were natural and beneficial. They needed only to be controlled. And we can see now today that the trusts, the corporations, just as early as our founders set foot on this soil, the corporations have been running the day. They've been running the show. All of the colonies were corporations. They were companies. The Virginia Company and others. All right. So at first, Roosevelt hoped. No. I skipped this part. Okay, but wavered on the trust. Large-scale production and industrial growth, he believed, were natural and beneficial. They needed only to be controlled. Still, he distrusted the trust's impacts on local enterprise and individual opportunity. So from the earliest times, individualism was a hallmark here, not collectivism, not the greatest good of the greatest number. That was the philosophical radicalism of Jeremy Bentham and company. The beginning of English socialism and English positivism. Distinguishing between good and bad trusts, he pledged to protect the good while controlling the latter, and that's very difficult. You know, today we look at this gangster banksters on Wall Street and Syngenta and Monsanto and, you know, Kellogg Brown and Root and Boots and Coots and BP and everybody else, and you go, God, which ones are good and which ones are bad? And how do you control them? And if you do it with law, legislation, and so on, it can harm the individual ones just, you know, to the point that they can't even get started in business, the Environmental Protection Agency, Clean Air Act, and all the rest of that. At the same time, the other big guys, now with the carbon credits, they can just buy indulgences from the Green Pope and they can keep on polluting. So how on earth do we do this? You know, if we're going to be the solution set, we need to be at least, you know, capable on these issues to discuss it. And this isn't the stuff you ordinarily hear at a Tea Party meeting, by the way. In 1903, Roosevelt asked Congress to create a Department of Commerce and Labor. Now, this is not the card-carrying commie. This is the guy with the big mustache, rode on the horse and shot the Winchester lever action. All right? 1903, Roosevelt. To create a Department of Commerce and Labor with a Bureau of Corporations, empowered to investigate corporations engaged in interstate commerce. Funny, we're back to the Interstate Commerce Clause, the Commerce Clause again. Congress balked. Of course they would balk. Congress is a bunch of bought and paid for whores, been that way since day one. Roosevelt called in reporters and in an off-the-record interview charged that John D. Rockefeller had organized the opposition to the measure. All right? All these books and things that we study here on this broadcast work together. Can't be done in a 2-hour segment. After and notice who he's calling in. He's calling in the reporters. All right? We're talking about publicity, going back to the muckrakers like Gustavus Myers and others, getting some publicity, bringing the bright light of media on these things at a time before the media really had yet been controlled, but it was about to be because John D. didn't like this bright light of public consideration. John D. Rockefeller had organized the opposition to the measure. After that accusation, editorials and many public figures clamored for action. You know, reminds us of the quote of the latter Roosevelt when he said he's calling for action and action now. That was the beginning of the war powers stuff. Roosevelt also undertook, somebody's sharing my Skype connection today. They've been on the line peeking and listening and talking in the background. Interesting development, to say the least. Roosevelt also undertook more direct legal action on February the 14th, 1902. Boy, almost exactly this time of year. He instructed the Justice Department to bring suit against the Northern Securities Company for violations of the Sherman Antitrust Act. It was a shrewd move. A mammoth holding company, Northern Securities, controlled the massive rail networks of the Northern Pacific, the Great Northern, and the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroads. Some of the most prominent names in business were behind the giant company. J.P. Morgan and Company, the Rockefeller interests, Kuhn Loeb and Company, and railroad operators James J. Hill and Edward H. Harriman. You know, Harriman, Brown Brothers, and Root, James J. Hill. All of this can be found in great detail, much greater than this, in Gustavus Meyer's works. And you can see all the details, the sort of details behind this. Shocked by Roosevelt's action, Morgan charged that the president had not acted like a gentleman, and Hill talked glumly of having to fight for our lives against the political adventurers who have never done anything but pose and draw a salary. Of course, Gustavus Myers reveals that most of these railroad men and corporatists had never done anything in their lives but pose and draw a salary. That's kind of like the pot calling the kettle black. Morgan rushed to Washington to complain and to ask whether there were plans to, quote, attack my other interests, notably U.S. Steel. Quote, no, Roosevelt replied, unless we find out they've done something that we regard as wrong. All right, now it's going to continue, and it goes on. Talks more about these trusts. Let's go back to the encyclopedia again. Implied trusts are those which arise by the operation of law from the deeds, wills, contracts, acts, or the conduct of the parties, either with or without their intention, express or implied trust, with or without their intention. It was just implied from the documents, but without any express words of creation. We don't see anything in here that says all men are created. Implied trusts are either resulting or constructive. Express and implied trusts therefore differ chiefly in that the former are created by the acts of the parties, while the latter are raised by the operation of law, either to carry out a presumed intention of the parties or to satisfy the demands of justice or to protect one against fraud. The article is going to continue here, and it's going to go through and it's going to talk a little bit about the various kinds of trusts. I'm going to jump over that for brevity. But there are four essential elements of a valid trust. All right, ready? 1, a designated beneficiary. Who is the beneficiary that this trust is created for? 2, a designated trustee, who must not be the beneficiary. Can't be one and the same. 3, a fund or other property sufficiently designated or identified to enable title thereto to pass to the trustee. And 4, the actual delivery of the fund or other property of a legal assignment, therefore to the trustee, with the intention of passing legal title thereto to him as trustee. Complicated rating. Hard to deal with mentally. But nevertheless, these are some basic understandings that might help us to understand what is actually going down in the greater scheme of things around us in the world we live. We'll be right back.